The SPY now turns to the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Craig, if I could start with you, a few days ago, health experts were alarmed when President Trump announced that he was taking hydroxychloroquine. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This comes at a time when the president is also making a point of not wearing a mask. What is the political thoughts behind this, if there are any?
I'm not sure that this is even all that political, except that I think it's more psychological. I think that we have an individual as president who's determined to prove he's right and experts are wrong. And in this case, he's actually medicating himself with a drug that has some fairly serious side effects, and the experts say not a known benefit. I thought about this a lot. I think every president ends up being the recipient of information from a number of sources outside of government as well as inside of government. I think that's been the case with everyone that either Al or I have worked with. But each of them takes that information and gets it checked by experts. And especially if you're going to put people at risk by following the example you're setting. So it's very confounding to me. If there's anything political here, it's the fact that President Trump seems to be getting information from very conservative publications that are looking for that ray of hope, and he just decided to be the ray of hope. But in this case, I think that hope is false, and I think it creates serious problems with the continued erosion of his credibility in office.
Al, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure. I know he doesn't wear a mask, but I'm not sure what he's taken. You know, it just seems to me he sort of announced this to goad the press. He's interested in diversion. He wants press to spend its time talking about anything but his record on dealing with the coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis that's come with it. Every day he talks about himself. He doesn't have to talk about the fact that he does not have a plan for dealing with it. And I just, as I was thinking about it, you know, my friend, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, joined by a bunch of other senators, including our own Senator Van Hollen, has introduced a bill that I think should be the basis of a bipartisan approach to the pandemic, and that is to increase the number of servers in AmeriCorps by 750,000 by 750,000 over the next 3 years. You can put 300,000 to work immediately by tracing contacts. There are all the nutrition problems we have to solve, logistics for that, trying to help kids who may not be able to go back to school and have to learn digitally and have a lot of trouble with that. It just seems to me that's a bipartisan idea. When Craig was with President Bush, he had his 1,000 points of light. Bill Clinton did AmeriCorps. All the governors, really on both parties, have endorsed it. And it seems to me, you know, at a time where we ought to lessen political partisanship, this might be a good start.
Al, let's stick with you. Last week, the Wisconsin Supreme Court overruled the governor's stay-at-home order in that state. And before that, the state legislature, against the advice of medical experts, overruled the governor's plans to have their spring primary election done by mail ballot, forcing thousands to stand in line during the pandemic. Is Wisconsin showing signs of being a failed state?
Wisconsin shows the real the consequences of a bitterly divided and pretty much evenly divided, but very polarized state. You know, Wisconsin's had a long history. I mean, it's the home of Senator Joe McCarthy. It also has some wonderful Republicans, like my former associate Tommy Thompson, who's the governor. But I want to give you a couple of numbers, because this is Wisconsin now in 2018 elected a Democratic governor. It has a Republican legislature, but it's only because of unbelievable gerrymandering. And until August 1st, it has a Republican Supreme Court, which was what the election fight was about, because the swing seat on the Supreme Court was out. And the Republicans wanted to keep the turnout down. And these numbers will tell you why. After the 2016 election, the Republicans had actually won 52% of the vote for the legislature, and they had a 64-35 majority, a little more than 52%, 64-35. But in 2018, the Democrats won a landslide victory. They flipped the governorship, and they won 161,000 more votes for legislature statewide than the Republicans. They won 53% of the votes, so that's a complete swing. And yet, because of gerrymandering, they picked up only one seat in the legislature. So I think it's 63-36 now. Now the court wanted to keep turnout down. The legislature also passed a bill that would have purged a lot of probably Democratic voters from the rolls. And the court wanted to keep turnout down because it had a 4-3 conservative majority. And one seat was up, and they believed that if they kept turnout down, particularly in Democratic areas, they'd be able to hold on to that seat. Well, they lost that. Unfortunately, the new justice doesn't go in until August 1st, and so the court then overruled the governor on the stay-at-home order, sort of its last vengeance against the Democratic governor, and I think it'll change after August 1st.
Craig, what are your thoughts?
Well, excellent analysis. I think it comes down fundamentally to leadership. And I'm thinking of two governors, Cuomo and Hogan, different parties, but very strong in their state, absolutely seized hold of the reins of government, whether they've not only their own administration, but the legislative bodies around them, and with whom they've had disagreements, to be sure, but have driven the policy and the approach and the execution of their response to this virus in those states. And I would say both of them also have been very fact-based in their efforts. They have listened to the experts. They've actually listened to many experts, and they've been the ones who come to the public, to their citizens, and explain the facts as they know them. So I think it's a leadership question, and I also think that we're seeing in Wisconsin, maybe other places, this notion that, well, maybe the experts aren't necessarily right, and politically, we need to get the economy going. We need to get people back at work. This is a very dangerous game. Finding that balance is not something that people who lack expertise in healthcare probably ought to be vested in doing. And, you know, maybe they'll be successful, but I think there's as good a chance that they'll end up stimulating an increase in the incidence of this virus in their states and in communities within their states, and simply trigger another reaction. I will say that everything that I'm seeing in the research that you're doing, Dave, and the SPY, says that the public is not ready to see all these restrictions lifted. The public is much more prudent and cautious than some of these governors who want to lead their state back to economic recovery. And I suspect that ultimately people in this case, the old saying is they'll vote with their feet. In this case, they'll vote with their feet by staying home or staying away from large gatherings in public places.
I want to end with a political question for you all, since I think you both were involved in having to draw a certain wing of your chosen party back to the presumptive nominee. There's a lot of anxiety now about whether or not Bernie Sanders supporters will come back and support Biden. And I know, Al, that you were very involved with Bill Clinton trying to bring the progressive left into his corner. So let's start with you. What suggestions do you have for Biden on that front?
Run straight to the middle. Run a general election campaign. The Sanders people that are going to vote for him are going to be almost every Sanders person will vote for him. There's a choice between Biden and Donald Trump. And the number one issue for almost anybody in the Democratic Party and a lot of independents is to beat Donald Trump. So I would not compromise my ability to win the swing voters who are going to decide the election in the suburbs of, Philadelphia and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and other places who are going to decide the election. I'm not going to sacrifice them to go after the Bernie Sanders, the most extreme Sanders voters. Now, I'm sure there are some Sanders voters who would never vote for Biden no matter what. And the reason doesn't have anything to do with Medicare for all. It's just they're sort of a disruptive group. I've sometimes been the victim of some of them on Twitter. And to me, the primaries weren't close. They were decisive, and most Democrats have a pretty good idea what Joe Biden is, and he ought to continue to be that, and he'll be the next president of the United States.
Craig, what would be your advice?
I was in this sort of unenviable position of trying to put together a convention for George Herbert Walker Bush after his first term, or as his first term was, as he was campaigning for a second term. And what you find at this point in time is that the people who were running but didn't succeed have individuals with exceptionally strong voices, but they're at a weakened position. And what they're trying to gain is a stronger position within the party. And so they hold out the chance of more support from their group if they're granted more visibility, more access in the party. And I'm not sure what the conventions are going to look like, but typically that's something they're seeking. And of course, in 1992, then President George Herbert Walker Bush went to a convention, or approached a convention with some real erosion in his own base. And so the idea was to make sure Pat Buchanan had a good speaking slot and delivered a good, strong message to help motivate that part of the Republican Party. Pat Buchanan did that. But we came out of that convention, although that we tightened the numbers in some way, we came out of that convention leaving the campaign with a lot of explaining to do to the very voters that Al was talking about, those swing voters who watched and became more concerned about where President Bush was going in a re-election campaign, as opposed to warming up to another 4 years of his presidency. So you're going to hear and continue to hear into the sort of this summer period, people who want to enhance their own standing. At this point, I think Biden needs to be true to himself. He needs to absolutely look at those swing voters. He also needs to motivate his base and his traditional block of voters to get out and vote. Interesting times, and honestly, with the nonstop cable news media and the spaces to fill, these people will continue to hear from them up until we get closer, I suspect, to the general election campaign.
Al Fromm, Greg Fuller, thank you very much.